foreign body is in response to our current situation and speaks to my history. Considering that I'm an immigrant, this is something that this is a body of work I think that has a effect on me that I'm still processing now. I think that so much has happened in the last few months that is in a lot of ways irreconcilable. Like we're all having to deal with trying to navigate a space that we thought we knew and has become something foreign, has become something alien, has become something we don't recognize. And for some of us, I think we are finding a way to navigate through that safely and with compassion and, with other people's concerns, in addition to our own, like being aware of them. But for others, I think that there's a resistance to that. There's a desire to like return to what is known, what is familiar, whether it's safe or not. And that's something that I'm having a hard time with, that there are so many people that aren't able to accept this new reality, Like early on in the virus, or during, like early, I guess, March, maybe even like February, I was talking to my mother who was talking to my grandmother in Korea. And so this was before there were real concerns here, and I was, during those conversations with my mother, it was just to hear what was going on in Seoul and in Korea, and that those same kind of precautions weren't being taken here, was, I think even that like affected how, the making of this work, even though the work I guess didn't start until maybe late March or early April. I did realize that at that point there was a shift in what I was going to make, because my mind just wasn't where it needed to be, to make the body of work that was what I thought I was going to make. But yeah, there's so many facets. I think that right now I'm trying to like weave together the like the full picture, and like what are all the elements that contributed to this body of work, and because it's so tied to like what we're all experiencing. Like it's just, there's so much of it that I think that I don't have a grasp on yet, or it's just too difficult to process. Yeah, well, it's directly tied to making this work, I think. The materials, like when I was beginning to make work for this show, I was using materials that were that took a little more time to develop, to work with. Like I was using graphite and charcoal and other materials that were, I guess, more time consuming the way that I draw. And as like the virus started to, like move across the country and the world, there was this kind of intensity and sense of urgency that I needed to communicate in the drawings, because it was really like, it was consuming me. And I couldn't sit with a piece for too long. I was having a difficult time like processing that drawing, and that sense of urgency was kind of, it was just overwhelming. Like I had to find a way to like draw it out of me. And returning to ink made a lot of sense because it's so immediate. And even that loss, the sort of, the way that I work with it, the kind of relinquishing of control in some ways, like the portraits are both like, pretty tight, or at least they seem like they're rendered in a way that, I don't know, suggests there's more control than there is. I'm really allowing the ink to, kind of move and blossom, and I'm rotating the paper to, to allow these like really beautiful, sort of soft and nuanced moments to happen rather than like forcing it. And that kind of, that way of making marks, I feel like it complemented or was a way of articulating the sort of, bodily sensation I was experiencing. And in a way, I mean, I guess even in the past when I was working with ink, that was always something I needed I needed my work to embody, like those moments when I felt like there was too much energy or too much that was outside of my control, and I needed to find a way to communicate that, to process that. Right, yeah. No, I didn't realize that until I'd returned to the medium, like on this paper. And I think part of maybe that time working with ink on Duralar, I spent a lot of time controlling the edge. There was that sort of, relinquishing of control within the space of the body, but the edge was something that I spent a lot of time with. And there's something about practicing that and then bringing it back to this substrate that transformed that technique. I didn't see it coming, but it makes a lot of sense to me, because throughout my practice, there's always this kind of learning and unlearning that happens. I think that part of that is it helps me to continue to challenge myself, in drawing, that I think that believing I know how to draw is detrimental to my practice. I think that I think that sort of piecing together a technique and testing different kinds of materials and substrates, and then throwing something entirely new in there, it creates new outcomes. But then when you return to those materials that are familiar, there's something new to discover, and that's always, I don't know, that's like one of my favorite things. I love it. No, definitely, it was a catharsis. It felt more as if it was a choice that I was staying at home, and working on a body of work, because that's not anything new. Like during the process of making a show, like I often just stay in my studio for hours, day after day. And there's something about that I really enjoy. Like I love being sequestered in my studio to build a body of work. I love that time. But to have these stay-at-home orders and know that your entire community and, this is affecting us nationally and globally, that all of us are in this like shared moment together, that the like intensity of that and how there's something about it that was just like unbelievable to me. It was just like it was so immense, the idea of that and the consequences of that, like the reality of all of this is just, it's too much to process. And so to be able to have a task that allowed me to bring it back to, to make it feel as if it's something that's just happening within my studio, allowed me to, I don't know, make it more digestible, It helped me to process how I was feeling, what I was seeing, and, I think even helping me figure out a plan to move forward, because I think that's been really difficult. Like, we don't know what next year is even going to look like, or next month, I can't even keep track of time, it just, everything feels, I guess in some ways it makes everything, we have a real sense of how insignificant a lot of things are, that we think have such an impact on our lives, right? That we build our lives around, and that when those things are gone, and what we're left with, there's something about that I really enjoy because it's helping us reprioritize, which I think is important. But I don't know. I feel like I'm still piecing it all together, and sometimes it makes sense, and other times it just like falls apart. When I was making this work in the studio, there was a moment where I was working on one of the pieces. It was kind of, I don't know, maybe like 4 to 6 weeks back or so, and I made a piece that I felt like could exist within the set of a Wong Kar-wai film. And I was actually thinking about the film In the Mood for Love, and I hadn't watched it in a while. I actually just rewatched it. And I don't know where or why exactly that film, and I guess part of it is just like that film is so emotional. There's something about the like heavily saturated scenes that like exude emotion. There's an intensity about it. And one of the pieces just felt like it could have come directly from the set. And with that in mind, I started making more of them that felt like they could exist within that set. And but I wasn't considering color then. I wasn't considering painting the walls. It was only after speaking with Eric that became an option. And so when it came time to choose a color, I referenced some of the images from the film itself to see like which colors were the best fit. So the process of making this work, I would photograph myself weekly, and in some ways, I guess that was a way to sort of document, what we were experiencing. I was thinking about that this is kind of a historic event, and to have something to help me remember what it was like to live through this, rather than to just read about it. I wanted something that would kind of put me back in this moment, help me like feel it in a way that both like gave me some distance, I guess, to process it, but then also just a reminder of this, because this is something that many of us, for like a generation or two have never experienced. But so photography has always been something that's been present in my practice. Like whether I'm working with myself or other women, I use photography as a way to help build the drawings. In the past, I've been thinking about Paul Ekman's research on microexpressions, and that he defines microexpressions as these moments where our body defies our will, and we are able to we express something that is maybe a deeper truth than we realize. And and the idea of that was really fascinating to me because our faces are able to mask so much, and we rely on facial expressions to communicate. This sort of like unconscious or subconscious network of communication that we rely on when we have even a conversation, right? I was looking for something like that within these photographs that I took of myself, something that would help me understand what I was experiencing, and how to build the work, like how what the work was saying, like what I wanted to communicate through this project, and also allow me to process, what we were all experiencing. And some of that has to do with what is his name? Roland Barthes' theories about the air in a photographic portrait. This thing that we feel when we see someone we recognize and it feels like them rather than just looks like them. And that's something I'm also really fascinated by, because a lot of photographs, like we've seen those that feel like the people we know and love, but we've also seen a lot of photographs that feel really flat, that feel just like a representation of that individual and not their whole selves. And so I think it's a fascinating process to go through, hundreds of photos and select the ones that have a kind of whisper of that, I think. And so that definitely was folded into the process of making these portraits, and like choosing these that both felt familiar, but then also there's something about it that felt difficult to recognize, because they're images of me, but at the same time, because of this experience, it didn't feel like, the portraits didn't feel quite like the self-portraits I was making in the past, because of, what we're going through. It feels strange to celebrate anything right now. There's something, it almost feels inappropriate, but at the same time, I think that we need those things to hold on to keep us motivated, to continue to practice the things that nourish us. I think that that's important. And also recognizing that making work, it just isn't for me, that this is something that I'm sharing with my community. And, I think that social media is playing a pretty important role right now in helping artists, share their work with a group that we, may not have access to. Just to be able to share work with a larger community, I think, is really valuable. And to find a way, as I have a little more distance from this work, even though there's a lot of pain and grief, and that is reflected in these self-portraits, there's also a lot of beauty. And I think to be able to transform these like painful events into something that I can witness and find something, I guess, beautiful to hold on to, is comforting. And I hope that that's the same for other people who see the work.